The phone rang, but Ethan Blake barely noticed. He stood at the window of his luxury penthouse, staring out at the city skyline. His city, built in part by his own hands, his deals, his vision. But tonight, none of that mattered. The letter on his desk demanded his attention, burning a hole through the carefully constructed facade of his life. It had arrived 3 days ago, wrapped in a faded envelope, the ink smudged but unmistakable. Blake & Sons, his father's company, a legacy he had inherited, polished, expanded into an empire. But the letter felt like a ghost. Something about it unnerved him, stirred memories he'd long buried. Ethan exhaled slowly, running a hand through his dark hair. For years, he'd been chasing success, power, control, wealth. He'd convinced himself that the past didn't matter, that the only thing of value was the empire he continued to build. But this letter was pulling him back to a part of his life he'd forgotten. Or rather, a part he had chosen to forget. The letter was from a law firm in a rural part of the country, about land his family had once owned, land he had never seen. The property was small, insignificant compared to the towering skyscrapers and sprawling developments that carried his name. But the lawyer's words were unsettling. Something needed his attention, something that couldn't be ignored any longer. Ethan had always prided himself on his ability to keep emotion out of business. But this was different. The weight of it pressed down on him, not just as a businessman, but as a son. His father, the legendary William Blake, had been his hero, his mentor. He had built their empire from nothing, or so Ethan had believed. But lately, small cracks had started to appear in the image of his father's legacy. Stories from former associates, whispers of deals that had left families ruined. He'd brushed it off, told himself every empire had its dark corners. Yet, now, with this letter in hand, those whispers felt more like truths. His mind flashed back to his childhood, the rare weekends when his father wasn't working. The old man had taken him to the country once, briefly, to inspect some land. Ethan couldn't have been more than 10 years old, but he remembered the tension in his father's voice, the way he had refused to answer Ethan's questions about the land or its previous owners. "Business is business, son," was all William had said. At the time, it had seemed like wisdom. Now, it felt like an excuse. Ethan knew he had to go. The next day, he drove out of the city, leaving behind the glass towers and neon lights that had come to define his life. The further he drove, the more alien the landscape became. Trees taller than buildings, roads so narrow they could barely fit his car. He hated it. It was too quiet, too far from the world of power he had mastered. When he arrived at the property, there was nothing impressive about it. A few acres of wild grass, dense trees, and a small river cutting through the land. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, and the only sound was the wind rustling the leaves. For a moment, Ethan felt a strange sense of calm, but it was quickly replaced by the sharp sting of unease. What was it about this place that had drawn his father so far from the city? He stepped out of his car, his polished shoes sinking into the mud. This was not his world. This land, with its wild beauty and quiet menace, was a reminder that there were things his wealth couldn't control. As he walked toward the riverbank, he spotted someone standing near the tree line. A woman. She was tall, with dark hair tied back in a messy braid, her clothes practical, worn from use. She watched him with a mix of suspicion and defiance. He wasn't used to being looked at like that. People respected Ethan Blake, or at least they feared him. But this woman seemed neither impressed nor intimidated. "You're trespassing," the woman said, her voice steady, strong. Ethan frowned. "I believe this land belongs to me." The woman crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "Legally, maybe, but that doesn't mean it's yours." He blinked, taken aback by the sharpness in her tone. "Who are you?" "Maya Brooks," she replied, stepping closer. "I've been fighting to protect this land from people like you for years." "People like me?" Ethan repeated, his voice tight with annoyance. "You don't even know me." Maya's laugh was short and humorless. I know enough. Your father stole this land from the people who lived here. Now you're here to finish what he started, aren't you? Develop it, build over it, turn it into another shiny monument to your family's greed. Ethan's stomach tightened. He wasn't used to being accused, especially not like this, by someone who clearly knew nothing about him. My father was a businessman. If he bought this land, it was because he saw potential in it. Potential? Maya's voice rose, her eyes flashing with anger. Your father didn't buy this land. He manipulated its owners, exploited them. They trusted him, and he took everything. Families were uprooted, lives were destroyed. And now you're here to clean up his mess? For a moment, Ethan couldn't speak. The accusation hung in the air between them, heavy with a truth he didn't want to acknowledge. He had always believed his father's business acumen was ruthless but fair. Now, standing here in the shadow of his father's past, he wasn't so sure. This land isn't just dirt and trees to me, or to the people who lived here, Maya continued, her voice softening, though her eyes remained hard. It's their history, their lives. You can't just erase that. Ethan clenched his jaw. I'm not here to erase anything. No. Maya raised an eyebrow. Then why are you here, Ethan Blake? What are you really looking for? That night, Ethan stayed at a nearby inn, unable to shake Maya's words. He stared at the ceiling, replaying the conversation in his mind. Could it be true? Had his father really taken this land through deceit? The idea gnawed at him, unsettling everything he thought he knew about his family's legacy. He had spent his entire life trying to live up to his father's image, pushing himself to be as successful, as commanding, as powerful. But now, that image felt like a lie, a shadow that had hidden darker truths. Ethan sat up, running a hand over his face. He couldn't ignore this. If what Maya said was true, if his father had betrayed the people here, then what did that make him? The heir to a stolen empire? The thought made his chest tighten, a feeling he couldn't shake. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, breaking the silence. It was his lawyer. Mr. Blake, we've reviewed the documents you asked for. There's something you need to see. It's about the land. Ethan's heart sank. He didn't want to hear it, but he knew he had to. Whatever was buried in his family's past was about to surface, and when it did, there would be no turning back. As the lawyer spoke, detailing the contracts and deals made decades ago, Ethan's worst fears were confirmed. His father had indeed taken the land through manipulation, using legal loopholes and hidden clauses to cheat its original owners. Ethan felt the weight of his family's betrayal settle on his shoulders, heavier than any deal or business decision he had ever faced. In 2 weeks, the board of his company expected a decision about the land's future. Develop it, just as his father had planned, or abandon the project entirely. Ethan knew one thing for certain. Nothing about this decision would be easy. Ethan Blake sat at his desk in the heart of the Blake Tower, staring at the pile of documents in front of him, his lawyer's words still echoing in his mind. The contracts, the records, the cold, calculated maneuvers his father had made to seize the land. It was all there, written in legal jargon that made it seem business as usual. But this wasn't just business. Not anymore. Ethan was now painfully aware of the faces behind those signatures, the families displaced, and the lives destroyed. And now, the responsibility for that legacy was squarely on his shoulders. For years, Ethan had been the master of his world, making decisions with a swift hand, confident in his place at the top. But as he flipped through the pages, he felt something unfamiliar: doubt. He had always believed that the ruthless pursuit of success was justified. He had told himself that, in business, the ends always justified the means. But now, he wasn't so sure. The shrill ring of his office phone shattered his thoughts. It was Victoria West, the head of his legal team. "Ethan, we need to talk about the board meeting." Victoria's voice came through, crisp and professional as always. "There's growing concern about this land deal. Some of the board members are hearing rumors. Maya Brooks has been speaking to the press. Ethan clenched his jaw. Of course, Maya wouldn't stay silent. He had expected as much, but it was happening faster than he had anticipated. "I'll handle it," he replied, though he wasn't sure how. The company's board was composed of sharks, people who would do anything to protect their investments, including turning against him if they thought he was a liability. They had followed his lead for years, trusting him to grow their fortunes. But now, with Maya stirring up trouble, they were beginning to question his leadership. "Just be prepared," Victoria added, her tone carrying a subtle warning. "They're not happy." Ethan hung up, the weight of the impending board meeting pressing down on him. His father had always said that business was a battlefield, and it was becoming clear that Ethan was about to enter a war on two fronts, one with Maya Brooks and the other with his own board of directors. The tension only grew as the days passed. Maya wasn't just fighting for the land in private anymore. She had gone public. The headlines were everywhere. Billionaire heir set to destroy sacred land. Local activists rally against Blake Empire, and the dark legacy of William Blake. The media had picked up her story, and the pressure was mounting. Ethan watched the news coverage with a grim expression. Reporters stood in front of the land, interviewing locals who told stories of how their families had been cheated, how the Blake family had promised prosperity but left them with nothing. And there, in the middle of it all, was Maya. She was calm, composed, but her words were sharp, cutting through the air with a conviction that resonated with the public. "This land doesn't just belong to one man. It belongs to the community, and we won't let it be taken from us again," she said, staring directly into the camera as though speaking to Ethan himself. The phone rang again. This time it was Jonathan Hale, his most influential board member, and someone Ethan had considered an ally. But Jonathan didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Ethan, what the hell is going on?" Jonathan's voice was clipped, anger barely concealed. "You've got the media breathing down our necks, investors are calling me left and right, and now there's talk about pulling out of the project. We're losing millions just from the rumors." Ethan took a deep breath. "I'm handling it." "You'd better be," Jonathan snapped. "Because if this doesn't turn around soon, the board's going to demand answers. And if they don't like what they hear, you're going to have a lot more to worry about than some activist." The call ended abruptly, leaving Ethan staring at the phone, the weight of Jonathan's words hanging heavy in the air. The board was losing patience, and Ethan knew that if he didn't present a solution soon, his position as CEO could be in jeopardy. He had worked his entire life to build this empire, to carry on his father's legacy. But now, that very legacy was threatening to bring everything crashing down. Ethan's mind raced as he walked into the boardroom the following morning. The tension in the air was palpable, the usual confidence of the board members replaced with quiet whispers and suspicious glances. Victoria West stood at the head of the room, her eyes locking with Ethan's as he entered. She gave him a brief nod, but even she seemed on edge. "Let's get started," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the turmoil raging inside him. Jonathan Hale wasted no time. "Ethan, we need answers. What's your plan? The media's not going to drop this, and our investors are starting to panic. Are we moving forward with the development or not?" Ethan paused, feeling the eyes of every person in the room on him. His instinct was to press forward, to ignore the noise and push the project through. That was what his father would have done. He wouldn't have flinched, wouldn't have cared about a few angry locals or bad press. But Ethan wasn't his father, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to be. "We can't move forward until we've addressed the concerns raised by the community," Ethan said slowly, carefully choosing his words. Jonathan's eyes narrowed. "The community? Ethan, this isn't about some community. This is about our investors. You think they care about a few farmers who were bought out decades ago?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, and Ethan could feel the tide turning against him. He was losing control of the narrative, losing control of his company. For the first time in his career, he felt trapped. "Look, I understand the concerns," Ethan began, but Jonathan cut him off. "Do you?" Jonathan's voice was cold, calculated. Because it seems to me that you've gotten yourself wrapped up in a PR nightmare. This activist, Maya Brooks, she's made you her personal target. And if you don't stop her, she's going to tear this company apart. We need to be decisive. Finish the project. Push her out. Make it clear that we won't be bullied by a handful of locals. Ethan's fists clenched under the table. The room was silent, waiting for his response. This was the moment. He could side with Jonathan, crush Maya's movement, and move forward with the project. It would be the easy choice, the one that would save his position, keep the investors happy. But it would also mean burying the truth, continuing the cycle of betrayal his father had started. His heart pounded in his chest. He had spent his life making decisions like this, choices that put profit above all else. But something had shifted. Maya's words, the stories of those who had been wronged, the weight of his father's actions, they all lingered in his mind, pulling him in a direction he wasn't sure he wanted to go. "We can't ignore what happened," Ethan finally said, his voice quiet but firm. "We need to take responsibility for the past. If we push forward without addressing the damage that was done, we'll be no better than what?" Jonathan snapped, his face flushing with anger. "Your father? Is that what you're about to say? William Blake built this company. He made it what it is. And you want to throw it all away because of a few bad deals from 50 years ago?" The room went still. Ethan felt the eyes of the board on him, waiting for him to either stand his ground or fold under the pressure. If you like the story, don't forget to subscribe. Later that evening, Ethan sat alone in his office, the lights of the city blinking below him. His mind was racing, the weight of the day's events pressing down on him. Jonathan had made his position clear. The board expected results, and if Ethan didn't deliver, they would find someone who would. But that wasn't the worst of it. After the meeting, Victoria had pulled him aside, her expression more serious than usual. "We've got a problem," she had said. "Jonathan's not just posturing. He's been talking to the investors behind your back. If you don't make a move soon, he's going to try and push you out." Ethan had stared at her, stunned. He wouldn't dare. Victoria's gaze had been steady, her tone matter of fact. "He already is. If you want to keep your position, you need to act fast. Either you shut down this Maya Brooks situation, or Jonathan's going to use it to take everything from you." The betrayal stung, but Ethan knew Victoria was right. Jonathan was ambitious, and with the company's future in jeopardy, he wouldn't hesitate to make a power grab. Ethan had always known the corporate world was cutthroat, but he had never expected the knife to come from someone he considered an ally. Now, alone in his office, Ethan had a choice to make. He could crush Maya's movement, win back the board's support, and secure his position. Or he could take a different path, a riskier path, one that might cost him everything but could set things right. As he stared at the skyline, the city he had helped build, Ethan felt the full weight of his father's legacy pressing down on him. His father had always chosen power, always chosen to win at any cost. But was that really the only way? Could Ethan break the cycle, or would he be consumed by it, just like his father? The next morning, Ethan made a decision. He called Maya. "I want to meet," he said, his voice calm but firm. "No press, no lawyers. Just you and me." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Maya replied, her voice laced with suspicion. "Why?" "Because we're not going to solve this in court," Ethan said. "And if we keep fighting like this, we both lose." Maya hesitated, then agreed to meet. The conversation would be the most important of Ethan's life, but it would also be the most dangerous. By reaching out to Maya, he was risking everything: his position, his company, and the fragile trust he had built with the board. But it was a risk he had to take. He had spent his entire life in control, but now, for the first time, Ethan Blake was about to face a challenge he couldn't win with power or money. It would take something more, a reckoning with his past and a chance at redemption. As Ethan drove to the meeting, his phone buzzed with a message from Victoria. "Jonathan knows. He's moving faster than we thought. Be careful." Ethan Blake had always been a man of certainty, a man who could predict the moves of his rivals, foresee the shifts in markets, and control the narrative around his company with precision. But now, as he sat across from Maya Brooks in the small, dimly lit cafe, he felt anything but certain. The air between them was thick with tension, their unspoken history, his father's sins and Maya's fight, hovering like a shadow over the table. Maya was not the kind of woman to be easily swayed. She watched him carefully, her eyes betraying the suspicion she had tried to mask. Ethan knew this meeting was a long shot, but he had to take it. The stakes were too high. His empire was at risk, his position as CEO under siege by Jonathan Hale's quiet machinations. And most of all, his conscience wouldn't let him walk away from the truth about his family's past. But Maya had her own battles, and they were deeply personal. This wasn't just about land to her. It was about justice. "I appreciate you meeting me," Ethan began, trying to keep his tone measured, though he could feel the weight of every word. Maya folded her arms across her chest, her gaze unwavering. "I didn't come here to listen to more empty promises, Ethan. You've had every opportunity to do the right thing, but you chose to follow in your father's footsteps. So why now? What's changed?" Her words hit hard, and Ethan swallowed the bitterness that rose in his throat. She wasn't wrong. Until recently, he had been ready to bulldoze over whatever obstacles stood between him and the success of his latest development project. It was only after uncovering the truth about his father's deception and seeing the fallout firsthand that he had started to question his path. "I'm not here to make promises I can't keep," Ethan replied, leaning forward slightly, trying to bridge the distance between them. "I came here because I want to find a solution that works for both of us." Maya's expression hardened. "A solution? You think there's a middle ground here? You took everything from us, from my family. Your father destroyed this community, and you expect me to believe you're suddenly interested in fixing that?" Ethan flinched at the word destroyed. He had read the contracts, the cold legal language that had reduced lives to numbers, to profits and losses. But hearing it from Maya, feeling the raw emotion behind her words, made it real in a way the documents never could. "I can't change what my father did," Ethan said, his voice quieter now, "but I can stop making it worse. I'm willing to pull out of the development, to work with you to preserve the land." Maya narrowed her eyes, skepticism clear on her face. "And what's in it for you? What do you get out of this, Ethan?" It was the question he had been dreading. The truth was complicated. He wanted to do the right thing, yes, but he also needed to save his company, to protect the empire he had spent his life building. And yet, for the first time, he wondered if protecting that empire was worth the cost. "I get to walk away from this with my conscience intact," Ethan said honestly. "I get to know that I didn't let my father's mistakes define me." Maya stared at him for a long moment, and Ethan could see the conflict in her eyes. She didn't trust him. She had no reason to. And yet, there was something unspoken between them, something that made her hesitate. "I need more than words," she said finally, her voice steady but softer now. "I need to see action. If you're serious about this, prove it. Show me you're not just saying what I want to hear to save your own skin." Ethan nodded, knowing she was right. Words wouldn't be enough. He had to show her, and the community, that he was serious about making things right. The cafe door swung open, and Ethan's phone buzzed on the table at the same moment. He glanced down to see a message from Victoria West. "Jonathan is moving faster than we expected. He's called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. Be ready." His stomach dropped. Jonathan was making his move. If the board sided with him, Ethan's career could be over by the end of the week. He had known this was coming, but not so soon. He had thought he'd have more time to sway them, to prove that stepping back from the development was the right choice, both morally and financially. But now, he was being forced into a corner. Maya must have sensed his sudden tension because her gaze sharpened. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice cutting through the silence. Ethan hesitated, then slid his phone across the table to her. She read the message, her expression hardening. "So that's it, then?" Your board is pushing you out, and now you're scrambling to save yourself? It's not that simple, Ethan replied. But even as the words left his mouth, he realized how hollow they sounded. It was exactly that simple. Jonathan was gunning for him, using the controversy over the land as leverage to take control of the company. And unless Ethan found a way to turn things around, he was about to lose everything. Maya pushed the phone back toward him, her lips pressed into a thin line. I'm not going to let your corporate drama distract from what's important here. You might be fighting for your company, but I'm fighting for my home. Don't confuse the two. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, a figure appeared at the cafe door, a man in a dark suit who looked severely out of place in the cozy, rustic setting. He approached their table, and Ethan felt a sinking feeling in his gut. Mr. Blake, the man said, his tone formal but tense. We need to talk. Ethan recognized him immediately. It was Andrew Lang, one of Jonathan's closest allies on the board. If Lang was here, it could only mean one thing. Jonathan was tightening the noose. Not now, Andrew, Ethan said through gritted teeth, already rising from his chair. This isn't the place. Lang ignored him, his eyes flicking to Maya before returning to Ethan. Actually, this is exactly the place. Jonathan thought you'd be here, making promises you can't keep. He sent me to deliver a message. Ethan's blood ran cold. Jonathan had been watching him, tracking his movements. That wasn't just a power play. It was personal. What message? Ethan asked, his voice tight. Lang's smile was thin, more of a sneer. The board is meeting tomorrow, and Jonathan has enough votes to oust you. But he's offering you a deal. You step down voluntarily, quietly, and he'll let you walk away with your shares intact. Resist, and you'll lose everything. Maya's eyes widened, and she looked from Lang to Ethan, her expression unreadable. Ethan felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had two options: fight Jonathan and risk losing his company, or take the deal and walk away. But either way, the development project was at the center of it all. If he backed down now, Jonathan would push the project forward, bulldozing over everything he and Maya had fought for. The room felt suffocating as Lang's words hung in the air. Ethan knew what this meant. Jonathan had been planning this for months, perhaps even longer. The land deal, Maya's activism, the media storm. It had all been manipulated, used as leverage to undermine Ethan's leadership. Jonathan hadn't just been reacting to the situation. He had been orchestrating it. And then it hit Ethan, a realization that nearly knocked the breath out of him. Jonathan had known about the land's history long before the media got involved. He had known about the contracts, the families that had been forced out, and the damage William Blake had done. But instead of revealing it, Jonathan had waited, biding his time until he could use that information to his advantage. Jonathan knew, Ethan muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He knew all along. Maya's brow furrowed. What are you talking about? Ethan turned to her, his mind racing. Jonathan knew about the land, about what my father did. He's been sitting on this, waiting for the right moment to use it against me. He's not just trying to take the company. He's trying to frame me as the villain in all of this. Maya stared at him, processing his words. So what? He's been using my fight, my family's struggle, to push you out? Ethan nodded, the pieces falling into place. He doesn't care about the land or the people. He just wants control. And if I go down, he'll keep the development going. He'll finish what my father started. Maya's face hardened, a flash of anger crossing her features. So I've been nothing but a pawn in your little corporate game? No, Ethan said quickly. You're not a pawn. You're the only one who's been fighting for something real. But if we don't work together now, everything you've been fighting for will be gone. Jonathan will destroy the land, and I won't be able to stop him. Maya was silent for a long moment, her eyes searching his face, looking for any sign of deceit. Finally, she spoke, her voice low but firm. If you're serious about this, if you really want to stop him, then you need to prove it. I'm not going to save your company for you, Ethan, but if you're willing to stand up to Jonathan, to stop the development and make things right, then maybe we can find a way to fight him together." The boardroom was quiet when Ethan walked in the next morning. Jonathan Hale sat at the head of the table, a smug smile on his face, his allies seated around him. Ethan could feel the tension in the room, the unspoken challenge hanging in the air. This was it, the moment that would determine everything. Jonathan stood as Ethan approached, his smile widening. "Glad you could make it, Ethan. I was beginning to think you might not show." Ethan met his gaze, the weight of the past few days bearing down on him. "I'm not stepping down, Jonathan." Jonathan's smile faltered, but only for a moment. "I don't think you understand how this works. You don't have a choice." Ethan took a deep breath. "Actually, I do, and I'm choosing to fight. I know what you've been doing, Jonathan. You've been using the land deal to manipulate the board, to turn them against me. But you've underestimated me." Jonathan's eyes narrowed. "And what exactly do you think you're going to do?" "You're out of options, Ethan." Ethan glanced around the room, meeting the eyes of the board members who had once supported him, but now looked uncertain, waiting to see where the chips would fall. "I'm ending the development," Ethan announced, his voice steady and strong. "We're pulling out of the project. We're going to restore the land, make amends for the damage that was done." Jonathan's face twisted in anger. "You can't do that. The board won't let you." Ethan met his gaze, unwavering. "I'm still the CEO, and as long as I am, I'll do what's right. You want to push me out? Go ahead and try. But I won't go quietly, and I won't let you destroy this company in the process." The room erupted in murmurs, the board members exchanging uncertain glances. Jonathan's plan was unraveling before his eyes, and Ethan could see the panic starting to set in. As the meeting descended into chaos, Ethan's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, expecting another message from Victoria, but what he saw made his blood run cold. It was an email from a whistleblower inside the company. Attached were documents, dozens of them, revealing that Jonathan had been quietly siphoning company funds into offshore accounts for years. Ethan Blake's heart raced as he stared at the documents on his phone, his mind barely able to process what he was seeing. The whistleblower had sent over a trove of evidence: bank transfers, offshore accounts, and secretive deals. All of it pointed to Jonathan Hale, the man he had once considered an ally, siphoning millions from the company. For years, Jonathan had been slowly draining the empire Ethan and his father had built, hiding his tracks beneath layers of corporate misdirection. This wasn't just a business rivalry anymore. This was betrayal on a scale Ethan had never imagined, a betrayal that went beyond boardroom politics. Jonathan hadn't just been trying to steal his position. He had been stealing from everyone: shareholders, employees, even the community that had invested in the Blake name. And Ethan hadn't seen it coming. His hands trembled as he gripped the phone, the gravity of the situation crashing down on him. He was no longer just fighting for his job or his father's legacy. He was fighting for the soul of the company and for his own sense of worth. Everything was at stake, and the weight of it felt suffocating. But somewhere in the storm of emotions, fear, anger, and guilt, was a small flicker of resolve. Ethan knew he had to act, but the question was, how? If you like the story, don't forget to subscribe. As the board meeting continued around him, the voices of the other members became a distant hum. Ethan could feel Jonathan's eyes on him, but he didn't look up. Instead, he stared at the documents on his phone, the reality of his father's empire unraveling before his eyes. For years, he had believed in the power of the Blake name. He had believed that his father, ruthless as he was, had at least built something solid, something untouchable. But now, with every passing second, Ethan realized how fragile it all truly was. His father's empire had been a house of cards, and Jonathan had been pulling out the foundations one by one. And what had Ethan been doing? He had been chasing power, profit, and prestige, blind to the corruption festering beneath the surface. The same corruption his father had once taught him to ignore in the name of success. The documents weren't just about Jonathan's theft. They were a reflection of Ethan's own failures. He had been too focused on expanding the empire, too focused on proving himself to his father's ghost, to see what was really happening. Now, the empire was crumbling, and Ethan was the one left holding the pieces. A sharp voice cut through his thoughts, yanking him back to the present. "Ethan, are you going to address the board, or are you just going to sit there?" Jonathan's voice was dripping with smugness, a thin veneer of professionalism barely hiding the satisfaction he must have been feeling. He thought he had already won. He thought Ethan was finished. Ethan stood, feeling every eye in the room shift toward him. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a brief moment, he felt the old instincts kicking in, the instinct to fight for power, to protect his own interests at all costs. But something had changed. This wasn't just about winning anymore. Slowly, he raised his phone, the documents still displayed on the screen. "I think it's time we all take a look at the truth," Ethan said, his voice steady but filled with a cold edge. Jonathan's face tightened, a flicker of unease crossing his features. "What are you talking about?" Ethan tapped a button, and the documents appeared on the large screen behind him, visible to everyone in the room. "These," he said, gesturing to the screen, "are records of offshore accounts. Millions of dollars siphoned from this company over the past 5 years. And they all lead back to one person." A murmur of confusion spread through the room as the board members squinted at the numbers on the screen. But it didn't take long for recognition to set in. One by one, they turned to Jonathan, their faces shifting from confusion to shock and then to anger. "What the hell is this?" one board member demanded. Jonathan's cool facade cracked. "This is a setup," he spat, his voice shaking with barely concealed rage. "Ethan, you're trying to distract them because you know you're losing control of the company. You're grasping at straws." "I wish that were true," Ethan replied, his eyes locked on Jonathan's. "But these documents don't lie. And there's more: emails, conversations, wire transfers. You've been stealing from this company, from all of us, for years." For a moment, the room was silent. Then, the outrage began to boil over. "Is this true, Jonathan?" One of the older board members, a man who had been loyal to Ethan's father, asked, his voice laced with disbelief. Jonathan's face hardened, but he didn't answer. Instead, he turned to Ethan, his eyes flashing with something dark, something dangerous. "You think this will save you?" he snarled. "You think they'll rally behind you because of this? You're finished, Ethan. It doesn't matter what you do. I'll still walk away from this, and you'll be left with nothing." Ethan's pulse quickened, but he held his ground. He could feel the tension in the room, the uncertainty hanging in the air like a storm about to break. This was the moment that would decide everything: his company, his future, his chance at redemption. Jonathan's words hung over Ethan like a dark cloud, threatening to pull him back into the chaos of the corporate war. But this time, something inside him resisted. He had spent his entire life chasing power, fighting to win no matter the cost. And for what? An empire built on lies? A legacy that had already crumbled beneath his feet? For the first time, Ethan wasn't thinking about himself. He wasn't thinking about his position, his reputation, or even his father's legacy. He was thinking about the people his family had hurt, the families that had lost their land, their homes, their futures. He was thinking about Maya Brooks, about the community she had fought to protect, and he was thinking about the company itself, the employees, the investors, the people who had trusted him to lead with integrity. This wasn't about winning anymore. It was about doing what was right. "I've spent my whole life running from the truth," Ethan said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "Running from the mistakes my father made and the mistakes I've made. But not anymore. I'm not going to let this company, my company, become a tool for greed and corruption. Not anymore." He turned to the board, meeting each of their eyes. "Jonathan has betrayed all of us. He's used this company for his own gain. And he's done it at the expense of everyone in this room and everyone who's ever believed in the Blake name. But I'm not going to let him get away with it. I'm stepping down as CEO, voluntarily. The room erupted in gasps and murmurs of shock. Jonathan looked as if he had been slapped, his eyes wide with disbelief. Ethan held up a hand to silence the room. I'm stepping down, he repeated, his voice firm, but not before I make sure this company is left in the right hands, and not before I make amends for the damage that's been done to the community, to the land, and to the people we've hurt. The board members stared at him, stunned. Ethan could see the doubt in their faces, the uncertainty, but he could also see something else, respect. For the first time, he was speaking not as a man clinging to power, but as someone willing to sacrifice it for something greater. I'll make sure the investigation into Jonathan's actions is thorough, Ethan continued, his eyes locking with Jonathan's. And I'll ensure that every cent he's stolen is returned to the company and the community. Jonathan stood abruptly, his face twisted with rage. You think this changes anything? You think stepping down makes you a hero? You're nothing, Ethan. You've always been nothing without your father. The words stung, but they didn't break him. Instead, they fueled the fire inside him. I'm not my father, Ethan said quietly, but there was strength in his voice. And that's why I'm going to walk away from this with my head held high. You, on the other hand, are going to walk away in handcuffs. Jonathan lunged toward Ethan, his face red with fury, but two security guards stepped forward, grabbing him before he could reach Ethan. You son of a... Jonathan spat, struggling against their grip. Ethan watched as the guards escorted Jonathan out of the room, the board members murmuring among themselves. He felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. For the first time in his life, he wasn't running from his past. He was facing it, head-on. The meeting ended in a blur of conversations and shocked expressions. Ethan felt drained, as though the weight of years had finally been lifted off his shoulders. But the battle wasn't over yet. He still had one more thing to do. Later that evening, Ethan found himself standing at the edge of the land his father had stolen so many years ago. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the distant sound of water flowing through the river that cut across the property. It was peaceful here, in a way that Ethan had never truly appreciated before. For the first time, he saw the land for what it was, not a potential development, not an investment, but a living, breathing part of the community. Maya was waiting for him by the old oak tree, her arms crossed as she stared out at the horizon. Ethan approached slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. You really did it, Maya said without turning to face him. You stepped down. I did, Ethan replied, stopping a few feet behind her. And I meant what I said in there. I'm going to make things right. Starting with this land. Maya turned to him then, her eyes searching his face for any sign of deceit. What's the catch? There's no catch, Ethan said, his voice sincere. I'm not here to take anything from you, or from the community. I'm here to give it back. Maya studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded. Then let's get to work. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the land, Ethan felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He had lost his position, his power, and in many ways, his father's legacy. But for the first time, he felt like he had found something more important, his own path. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Victoria. The board had officially opened an investigation into Jonathan, and the police were preparing charges. It was over. But as Ethan slipped the phone back into his pocket, he knew this was just the beginning. The real work was only starting. Maya stood beside him, looking out at the land. This won't be easy, you know, she said, a faint smile on her lips. Ethan smiled back, the weight finally lifting. Nothing worth doing ever is. Ethan Blake stood at the edge of the land that had once been a symbol of everything wrong with his family's legacy. The evening sun cast a soft, golden light over the hills, and a gentle breeze stirred the leaves of the old oak tree nearby. It was peaceful here, far from the chaos of the corporate world he had left behind. For the first time in his life, Ethan wasn't thinking about what came next. He was simply in the moment, content with where he stood. The last few months had been transformative. He had stepped down as CEO, exposed Jonathan Hale's corruption, and worked to return this land to the community his family had once wronged. It had been the hardest decision of his life, but as he looked around at the land now, with plans underway to preserve it and rebuild the local community, he felt a deep sense of peace. He had lost power, influence, and much of the wealth that had defined him, but he had found something far more valuable, a sense of purpose. Maya Brooks walked up to him from the distance, her steps quiet on the soft earth. She had been instrumental in all of this, forcing Ethan to face the truth, challenging him to change, and working with him to make things right. Their relationship had evolved from adversaries to partners in this endeavor, and Ethan had come to respect her more than anyone he had met in his corporate life. "You're still here," Maya said, coming to stand beside him under the oak tree. "I like it here," Ethan replied, a faint smile on his lips. It was true. The land, once nothing more than a financial opportunity in his eyes, had become a place of reflection. Every time he visited, he felt further removed from the man he used to be, the man who would have bulldozed over everything to get what he wanted. Maya looked at him thoughtfully, then nodded toward the horizon. "We've made progress, but there's still a lot of work to do. Are you ready for that?" Ethan's smile widened slightly. For the first time in a long time, "I'm ready for anything." That wasn't something Ethan would have said a year ago. Back then, everything had been about control, controlling his company, his image, and his future. Now, he was learning to let go, to take things as they came. He no longer needed to dominate the world around him to feel whole. If you like the story, don't forget to subscribe. In the weeks after his resignation, Ethan had fully committed himself to the project of restoring the land and making amends for the harm his family had caused. He worked with Maya and the local community leaders to create a plan for sustainable development, one that respected the history of the land and provided opportunities for the displaced families to return and rebuild. It wasn't easy. Many of the people in the community were still skeptical of Ethan's intentions, and he didn't blame them. His name had been synonymous with greed and exploitation for years, and it would take time to earn their trust. But instead of becoming defensive or trying to impose his will, Ethan did something he had never done before. He listened. He listened to the stories of the people his father had wronged, listened to their concerns, their hopes, and their anger. At first, it had been difficult to hear, but gradually Ethan found that listening was freeing. He didn't have to be the one in control. He didn't have to have all the answers. He could simply be part of the solution, rather than the problem. "People are starting to trust you," Maya said one afternoon as they walked the property together. "They're starting to see that you're different." "I hope so," Ethan replied, "but I don't expect them to forgive me, or my family, overnight." Maya glanced at him, her expression softening. "You've done more than most people in your position would have. You've taken responsibility. That's more than enough for now." Ethan nodded, but deep down, he knew that taking responsibility wasn't a one-time act. It was something he would have to carry with him for the rest of his life, a weight he had chosen to bear. But for the first time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like the right thing to do. The day of the official handover came with little fanfare, but it was a significant moment nonetheless. Ethan, Maya, and several members of the community gathered under the oak tree to sign the final agreements that would transfer the land back to the people who had been displaced by his father's actions. It wasn't the kind of victory Ethan had once sought. There were no headlines, no accolades, but it was the most meaningful win of his life. As he signed the papers, Ethan felt a weight lift off his shoulders. This was the end of the Blake family's hold over this land, and the beginning of something new. Something that wasn't about legacy or wealth, but about healing and redemption. After the meeting, Maya lingered behind while the others left. She looked at Ethan, a question in her eyes. "What's next for you?" Ethan hadn't thought about it in detail. For so long, His life had been consumed by his role in the company, by the constant drive to be successful, to prove himself worthy of his father's legacy. But now, with that behind him, he wasn't sure what came next. And for the first time, that uncertainty didn't scare him. "I'm not sure," Ethan admitted, looking out over the land. "But I'm okay with that." Maya smiled. "That's a good place to be." As the sun set over the hills, Ethan and Maya stood together, watching the land they had fought for. It had been a long and difficult journey, but they had arrived at a place of understanding, a place where the past no longer defined them and where the future was theirs to shape. Ethan knew he would never fully escape the shadow of his father's actions, but he had found a way to step out from under that shadow. He had learned that true power didn't come from controlling others or building an empire. It came from doing what was right, even when it was difficult, even when it cost you everything you thought you needed. He had lost his title, his position, and much of the wealth that had defined him. But in losing those things, he had gained something far more valuable: a sense of peace, a sense of purpose, and, most importantly, a sense of who he truly was. As they turned to leave, Maya looked over at him with a grin. "So, are you ready to get your hands dirty? There's still a lot of work to do." Ethan laughed, a sound that came easier to him now. "Yeah, I think I am." Together, they walked back toward the community, the last light of day fading behind them. Ethan Blake, once a man defined by his drive for power and control, had finally found something deeper, a life defined not by what he could take, but by what he could give. Join our journey and be part of the story. Hey there! If this story resonated with you, don't leave without letting us know. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss another chapter in our journey together. We've got even more powerful stories on the way that you won't want to miss. Drop a comment below and tell us, what part of Ethan's transformation hit you the hardest? How did this story make you feel? We'd love to hear your thoughts and connect with you. And before you go, stick around for the next story that's waiting for you. It's right on your screen, ready to inspire, surprise, and take you on a new emotional ride. Let's grow together, one story at a time. See you in the next one.